Welcome back to this new video and ReFramework tutorial. In the last video I talked about the second state, get transaction data. In this video I will talk about the third state, process transaction. First I will talk about the variables and workflows, which are used in this state. Then I will go through the different activities within this state. Let's go. Here are all variables in the main workflow of ReFramework. In the last videos I talked about these variables, which are used in the first two states for the first time. But they will also be used in the third and fourth state. We still have two variables, what we didn't use in the first two states, business exception and retry number. Business exception variable is of type business rule exception, and will be used guess for what? Of course to store business exception, if we got one in the third state. So we use this variable to store the occurred business exception, so that we can define which transition from the third state should be selected. Here is the ReFramework template and here is the third state. As you see we have three transitions from this state. One of them is called business exception. The condition for this transition is, if the business exception variable is not nothing. In this case it means, that we have a business exception. So here we go to the second state. The last variable in ReFramework is RetryNumber. It's of type integer and will be used to calculate the retries of a transaction item. So we can use this variable to count the retries of an item, so that we can set decisions later using it. That's all about the variables of ReFramework template. Let's now switch to the workflows, which we have as standard in ReFramework template. So we have 8 workflows. In the last two videos I also talked about these 4 workflows, which are used in the first two states. We still have 4 workflows, which are used in the third state, therefore I will talk about them in this video. First I will explain each workflow in general, for what it can be used. Later I will show you the workflows directly in UiPath and explain them in detail. Let's start with the first one, set transaction status. We use this workflow to set the status for the transaction item, after processing it. Here we have two options. Successful and failed. Either the item is successfully executed without any errors. In this case we set the item as successful. Or we had exception during the execution of the item. It means, we have either system exception, or business exception, or any other exception types. In this case we set the item as failed. For failed option we also have two options. Either business or application. Business means that we have a business exception. Application means, that we don't have business exception, but other exception types. The next workflow is close all applications. As the name suggests, we use this workflow to close the applications, which we use in the process. We use this workflow in case of an application exception. But also in the last state, end process, once the execution of the process is finished. The next workflow is RetryCurrentTransaction. We use this workflow to decide, if we want to retry a transaction item or not. So we calculate in this workflow, how many retries do we have for the current item, and also check if we want to retry. Depending on the result, we either retry the execution of the transaction item or not. But the retry of execution doesn't happen in this workflow, but in another workflow. This means that we here only check if retry should happen or not. We use this workflow only in case of an application exception. And the last workflow is TakeScreenshot. We use this workflow to take a screenshot and save it in a specific folder, so that the developer can later easier debug the process. We use this workflow only in case of an application exception. That's all about the workflows of ReFramework template. We still have a workflow, which we use in ReFramework template. It's process workflow. This workflow will be used to implement the process, which we have. It means that we use it, to set the main process, what we want to do. For example processing invoices, extract data from a source, sending emails or something else. So here we implement the main steps of a process. We either implement the steps directly in this workflow, or we can implement them in different workflows. Then we can invoke the workflows in this workflow. It depends on the process and the activities, what we have. Let's now switch to UiPath to see the third state and talk about the different activities. We have here the third state. We reach this state as long as we got a new item from the second state. The third state is then to process this new transaction item. The state contains only one activity in the entry section. In exit section we don't have any activities. And we have 3 transitions from this state. Let's first see the activity in entry section. It's a try-catch activity. Within this activity we have first an assign activity, where we set the business exception variable equal to nothing. After that we have invoke workflow, to run the process workflow. We have two input arguments for this workflow: the transaction item and the config variable. Let's see the workflow. As you see, we don't have any activities currently. In this workflow we can add the different activities, which we need to do something. As already mentioned, we can implement the activities here in this workflow. Or we can create new workflows. In each workflow we implement some steps. And then we invoke the workflows here in this workflow. As you also see, this workflow has sequence layout, but we can also use other layouts, like flowchart or state machine. In this workflow a transaction item will be processed. So these are the activities in try section. If we have any exception in these activities, we move on to catches section. Here we have two catches. The first one is business rule exception, to catch the occurred business exceptions. Here we set the variable business exception equal to the occurred exception. The second catch is system exception, to catch the other exception types. Here we also set the variable system exception equal to the occurred exception. This means here, that we don't throw any exception, but we only save the exception in a variable. Using this variable, business exception or system exception, we can later define what we want to do. What I mean here, that we can later know if the item is successfully executed, or if we have a business or system exception. And we can also define, to which state should we move after executing the state. In this way we also don't have a termination for the process. And in finally section we also have a try catch activity. Please make sure, you know when the finally section will be executed. To recap, the finally section will be executed if we have an exception or not. It means, the try section will be executed first. If everything is okay, we move on to finally section directly. But if we have an exception in try section, we first move on to catches section, and then to finally section. This means, that finally section will be always executed. So in try section we invoke the workflow, SetTransactionStatus. Here we have the following arguments. We have the config variable, the both exception variables, and the other transaction variables. If we get an exception in this workflow, we move on to catches section. Here we have only a log message activity. And in finally section we don't have any activities. Let's see the workflow, SetTransactionStatus. In this workflow we first check, if the item is successfully executed or not. This can be checked using the exception variables, business exception and system exception. If both variables are nothing, it means that the item is successfully executed. In this case we move on to the sequence success. But if one variable from both variables is not nothing, it means that we have an exception. In this case we check again, if we have a business exception. This can also be done using the business exception variable. If this variable is not nothing, it means we have a business exception. In this case we move on to business exception sequence. But if this variable is nothing, it means we have a system exception. In this case we move on to system exception sequence. In case of success or business exception we have also a sequence to increment the transaction number. In case of system exception we don't have any other activities after the sequence. Let's start with success sequence. As mentioned, in this case the item is successfully executed. Here we check first, if we have a transaction item, and also if the transaction item is a queue item. What does it mean here? As mentioned in the last video, we could have transaction item as queue items in the queue, but we could also implement the process without a queue. The transaction items in this case are directly from the source, like rows from an Excel file. Therefore we have the check here, to make sure that the transaction item is a queue item. So if the transaction item is a queue item, we set the status as successful. As you see, we selected successful status. And we have two options, successful or failed. And we used also the transaction item argument. So after setting the status for the transaction item, we have add logs activity, to add log fields to the process. What does it mean? If you don't know, please check the last video, I talked about this point there. So we add the following log fields into the process. Then we have a log message activity. After that we remove the added log fields again. This was the first option for a process transaction item. After this sequence we have the following sequence. Here we first increment the transaction number, to get the next transaction number later. This is helpful then, if we don't use a queue in the process. So using this variable we can define how many items are processed and we can select the next one. But if we use a queue in the process, we don't really need this variable. After that we set the retry number equal to 0. Because we already processed the item, and in the next step we will go ahead with the next transaction item. Therefore we set the retry number equal to 0. It means here that we reset the counter of retries, to allow the next transaction to be retried the correct amount of times. That's all about the successfully executed transaction item. Let's now see the second option, business exception. Here we also first check if we have a transaction item, and if it's of type Q item. In this case we set the item as exception. As you see we selected the status failed. And below you can see that we selected business error type. We can here select business or application. So here we have a business exception, therefore we selected business option. We can also here set the reason for the exception. Here we use the message of the occurred exception as reason. You can here use something else or also add more information. After that we add log fields, add a log message, and then remove the added log fields. In this case we also increment the transaction number, and also reset the retry number. That's all about the business exception item. Let's now see the last option, item with a system exception. Here we also check at the beginning, if we have a transaction item, and if it's of type Q item. But in this case we store the result in a variable, Q retry of type Boolean. We do this here to define, if we have a Q item, because the queue can automatically retries a Q item, in case of application exception. But in case we don't use a queue, we need to calculate the retries and set the maximum count of retries manually in the process. What I mean here, that we have two options. Either we use a queue in the process. In this case we can use the retry option from Orchestrator for the queue. Or we don't use a queue in the process. In this case we have to define, how many times should an item be retried, in case we have an application exception. We will use this variable later in the next steps. So after checking the transaction item, if this item is a queue item, we set the status as failed. Here we set the error type equal to application. And for the reason we also use the message from the occurred exception, but in this case we use the system exception variable. After that we set the retry number equal to the retries of the item from Orchestrator. As mentioned, in this step we have a queue item. For a queue item we have the property retry no. Using this property, we can get the retry number of the current transaction item directly from Orchestrator. But if we don't use a queue, we can calculate the retry number in the process directly. Here is a question, why we differentiate between business exceptions and application exceptions. The difference is, that we don't need to retry the execution of an item, in case we have a business exception, because we will have again a business exception in the next retry. But in case of application exception, we may not have an exception in the next retry, therefore we retry the item. This is the reason why we set either business or application exception. After that we also add log fields, but with other values. The next step is invoke RetryCurrentTransaction Workflow. Here we have the following arguments, which we need for the workflow. Let's open this workflow. Here we first check if we set a maximum retry number in the config file. If you remember the config file, we have a key, max retry number. We check here if the value is bigger than 0. If not, we have a log message, and then we increment the transaction number. The execution for this workflow is finished. But if the number is bigger than 0, we go to the next decision stage. Here we check if the max retries is reached. We do this using the RetryNumber variable. If we reach the maximum retries for the item, we reset the retry number, and then we increment the transaction number. But if the maximum number is not reached, we have a log message. After that we check if we want to use the 𝗐𝗫retry option. This can be done using the 𝗐𝗫retry variable, what we calculated at the beginning of the system exception sequence. If it's true, we increment the transaction number. If it's false, we increment the retry number. That's all about this workflow, how it works. But let me explain it in other words. We use this workflow to check if we want to retry the execution of the failed transaction item. If we want to retry the execution, we also check if we reach the maximum retries count. Here we have to differentiate between two options, either we use a queue in the process or not. In case we use a queue, we don't need to use the value from the config file, because we can use the retry option from Orchestrator. There we can define if we want to retry the failed transaction items, and we can also set the maximum retry number. But in case we don't use a queue, we have to define in the config file how many retries could we have for a failed transaction item. Therefore we have these different decisions and variables. Later in the practice videos I will show you which activities and decisions do we need, in case we have a queue or not. The ReFramework template contains always the both options, but later depending on the process, we can remove some variable and activities, which we don't need, because we may have a queue or not. Therefore we can only use some variables and activities, and remove the other activities and variables. I mean, the ReFramework is in general for each process type, but not each activity and variable must be used. That's all about this workflow. I hope you could understand it, but if you have any questions please write us in comments. So in this workflow, we decided if we want to retry the failed item or not. Now we remove the added log fields. And then we have a try-catch activity. In this activity we invoke the next workflow, TakeScreenshot. Here we have two arguments. The folder, where we want to store the taken screenshot. For this argument we use the value from the config file. And we can also set the file path. It's empty as default, but you can define a specific file path. In case we have an exception in this workflow, we move on to catches section. Here we only have a log message activity. And finally section contains no activities. Let's see the TakeScreenshot workflow. First we take a screenshot using this activity, and store it into this variable. It's of type image. After that we check if we don't have a file path as input for this workflow. If we don't have a file path, we set it here using this assign activity. Here we use the folder argument, the following name with the current time. After that we have the following variable. It's of type file info. So here we get the information about the file path variable. We use this information to check if the directory exists or not. If the directory doesn't exist, we create it here. At the end we save the screenshot in this path, and then we have a log message. After that we go back to SetTransactionStatus Workflow. Here we still have an activity. It's also a try-catch activity to invoke the following workflow. Here we don't have any arguments. Let's open the workflow. As you see, we don't have any activities currently, but we can add activities to close the used applications. So we use this workflow to close the applications, in case we have a system exception. If we have an exception in this workflow, we move on to catches section. Here we have first a log message activity. Then we have again a try-catch activity, to kill the applications. It means here that we kill the applications, if we couldn't close them normally. I talked about this workflow in the first state video. If we have also here an exception, we move on to catches section. Here we only have a log message activity. And in both finally sections we don't have any activities. As mentioned, we don't have any activities after this sequence. That's all about this workflow. In case of exceptions in this workflow, we move on to catches section. Here we also have a log message activity. In finally section we don't have any activities. That's all about the activities in the third state. Let's now talk about the transitions from this state. As mentioned, we have three transitions. The first one, system exception, to move on to initialization state, in case we have a system exception in this state. The second one, business exception, to move on to get transaction data state, in case we have a business exception in this state. And the last transition, success, to move on also to get transaction data state, in case we don't have any exceptions in this state. Let's see the conditions of these transitions. Here we check the system exception variable. If it's not nothing, then we have a system exception. In this case we move on to initialization state. The condition here is, if the business exception variable is not nothing. In this case we have a business exception and move on to get transaction data. And the last condition is, if both exception variables are nothing. In this case we don't have any exceptions, and we also move on to get transaction data state. That's also all about the transitions. I hope you could now understand the third state better. I know it's not easy to understand everything without examples, but don't worry, I will publish new videos about use cases, how to use ReFramework. I just wanted first to explain each state in details, so that you can understand it before we start practice. We still have one state in ReFramework, what I will explain in the next video. If you have any questions about this state or the last two states, please don't hesitate to contact us. Have a good day and see you in the next video.